And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining us today, folks, is Ryland Moore, the Managing Director of Business Development, and Bryan Shipley, the Co-CEO and Chief Investment Officer at Arnerich Massena. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks Kevin. Great to see you.
Of course. So because we got a dual interview here, we'll start with you, Bryan. Tell us a little bit about the origin of Arnerich Massena. Why are you at the Mo Summit today?
Sure, yeah. We've, Arnerich Massena, we actually just celebrated our 30th anniversary, so we've been at this for quite some time. And our journey around impact really started in kind of the mid-2000s, but just to provide a little context on who we generally serve, it's largely kind of families, high net worth individuals, and then what we consider kind of underserved endowments and foundations, so kind of the small middle market where they can still kind of get a bespoke custom portfolio with a high level of service that you would expect from kind of a boutique investment advisory firm. But going back to our journey, it's just been such a crazy path over the last 15 years or so. When we started on this journey, really nothing exists for our investors to really deploy capital. And it was really our forward-looking investment philosophy that kind of drove our pursuit of this space. I think what most advisory firms have kind of felt is their clients have been pushing them into the conversation. For us, it was quite the opposite. We were kind of dragging our client base into it. And even today, as we have new clients come on and they're just interested in working with Arnerich Massena in general because of our reputation, the great research that we do, they're still getting what we would consider largely an impact portfolio, where they're investing in these managers who are thinking further out on the curve and just really taking advantage of what we think are going to be some pretty dramatic tailwinds, a pretty big shift from what we've seen over the last, call it 10 to 20 years, where it's just all been about kind of large cap growth and just mega cap companies kind of dominating the space. It's going to be harder for companies to really differentiate themselves going forward, and having tailwinds behind them around impact and food, energy, water, those are going to be some great themes that we think our clients are going to benefit from going forward.
Amazing. And tell me a little bit about the philosophy that you've been pulling your customer base into. Tell us a little bit about that and articulate it for our audience.
Yeah, I think one thing that's made our firm unique, and frankly, I think it's what really gets Ryland, myself, our entire research team up every day, is just a willingness to think differently. So not just looking at the past and having that guide your investment decisions, but what's truly going to matter in the market going forward? What's going to be rewarded in the market going forward? And there's all sorts of different lenses you can look through. One could be just more thematic investing, some of those themes that I talked about earlier. But it could go as far as just a willingness to look at investment strategies, investment managers earlier on than maybe what the institutional appetite would call for. I think what you generally find in our industry, for people to gain comfort, they need different thresholds to gain that confidence, whether it's a certain number of years and a certain track record, a level of AUM, the firm needs to be around for a certain number of years. I think one thing that's made us unique in kind of really kind of flexing that muscle or that willingness to be courageous and be a kind of an early adopter of different strategies and different managers, and it has immensely benefited our clients, is recognizing that markets change. Markets go through cycles. Managers go through kind of life cycles where early on they're really incented to outperform because they want to make that mark, and so they're really tied to the success of the strategy. And a manager will go through its life cycle where in the later stages, a decade, 2 decades, even 3 decades in, maybe that founder's retiring, maybe that investment team that really kind of set that track record has kind of made their mark and they're transitioning away from really being kind of performance oriented. Just let's not mess this up, right? Let's just keep this great thing going. And so you see a lot of the courage and the willingness to be different that really drove that success come off a little bit. So those are some of the things that we need to be looking out for. That's just at the investment manager level. You could apply that to a theme as well, whether it was investing in private equity and hedge funds back in the 90s when it wasn't so institutionally adopted. It could have been investing in the frontier markets in the 2000s when nobody was looking in that space. Quite possibly a very interesting space to be looking at today. And what we look at today, as we call it, kind of Impact 2.0, is what are those segments of the economy, segments of industry that are going to have those tailwinds going forward? And we kind of view it as what does the world need, right? It's not so much anymore what do we want in terms of iPhones and new gadgets and gizmos, but what do we need to survive survive and thrive as a country, as a nation, that's going to benefit from that going forward.
So we're at just the beginning then of Impact 2.0. What are you seeing, Ryland, from the market, from the people that you're speaking with, the investors? What are they sharing with you? Describe your customer for our audience.
Sure. I mean, it's been really wonderful to watch the evolution of what's going on with the discussions around impact and ESG. But I feel like a lot of the investment opportunities that are available today in the marketplace, most investors come at it from a perspective of exclusion. So they say, well, I don't like this sector, or I don't like these things, or I don't like these types of businesses. And so therefore, I'm going to exclude them from my portfolio. And what we're saying is with Impact 2.0 is to really lean into those sectors that you do really value. So do you value clean water, renewable energy technologies, access to global healthcare, food and agriculture? So where are you able to lean in? Also on the social side of things, that's been a really amazing topic that we've started to see opportunities to invest in companies that are starting to track that data and provide the data that we need to make good, sound decisions on, are we going to invest in this company over that company?
We've seen a lot of traction with ESG pick up. But of course, many people think there's a difference between ESG and impact investing. Bryan, would you kind of explain your philosophy and your perspective on this?
It's a great question. Again, kind of going back to that start of that journey 15 to 20 years ago, ESG was kind of the new vernacular. And so the strategies of the product really didn't exist. And we view kind of that ESG conversation, it's less about return generation and it's more about just risk mitigation, or at least understanding the risks that the business is taking. And it could be future risks as well, right? If you start to see more government policy that could influence how a company is managing kind of their resources, how they're operating their business, that's a risk. That's a foreseeable risk in the future. To be quite frank, I mean, the conversation around ESG has completely evolved over the last 15 years. Again, it was us kind of pulling investment managers, our clients, into that conversation. Today, it's just a natural part of the conversation that we have with every single one of our managers. And so I think if you are completely ignoring that, that's not a great strategy. So it's just, what I said nearly 10 or 15 years ago is ESG just becomes kind of a way of life, and every business, every organization, especially if you're working in the investment management community, you need to be talking about that. You need to be aware of those kind of risks. And so that's why we're really excited about, we don't necessarily think it's a starting point, but it is early innings for kind of this idea of Impact 2.0, especially with a lot of what we're seeing going on around the world. There is much more of a focus on commodities. And you look at traditional commodity index, and they've basically been kind of dead for the last 10 years. We haven't seen really anything in the form of inflation, but here we are, early 2022, and it's a completely different conversation. And so, you're seeing some of those kind of older traditional energy sectors really benefiting, but there's going to be lift of kind of newer forms of energy, resource efficiency, those kind of things that are really going to benefit from this kind of new paradigm of higher interest rates, higher inflation that I think we're going to have to adjust to going forward.
How have you seen the shift, I guess, the perspective of investors in terms of nuclear energy? Do they see it as a positive thing or a negative thing? In terms of also balancing their portfolio, what are you seeing in the market?
It's really fascinating when you start talking about forms of what we would consider renewable energy, which obviously includes nuclear energy. Some investors still can't get over the mentality of pollution that occurs from having reactors around, or what's gone on at 3 Mile Island. Others see it, like Bill Gates, for example, and his company, are looking at it as it's a new age and a new way to create a resource that is completely sustainable and can be controlled from a perspective of environmental degradation. So I don't think everybody's willing to jump into it right away, but at the same time, I think it's something you have to have in the conversation when you're talking about renewables.
And then Bryan, what about, we're in this, global economy. Obviously, we saw a lot with supply chains and how interconnected everybody is. What's the case for American businesses right now, American manufacturers? Are you seeing in the markets investors focused on American companies that have supply chains located here at home?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a pretty big change that we see going forward. I don't think we swing all the way back to isolationism. I mean, we've been in this move to kind of global free trade and just globalization in general for decades on end. And, economies go through kind of massive swings in kind of sentiment and where things are headed. we were certainly kind of tipping on an extreme of globalization about a decade ago. You've started to see countries become much more kind of self-focused or more insular. I think we're at a point where we definitely start tipping back towards at least being aware of your risk as a country, as a company, on where your supply chains are coming from. And so I just think it's going to be a natural progression to at least recognizing that some local sourcing of resources, whether it's energy, materials, that's going to be a natural fallout. But the reality is the globe benefits from, countries and companies really specializing in what they're really good at. And to think that we can solve for, all of the things that the American consumer wants to consume and take advantage of here in the United States, the reality is the price of doing that would be astronomical. And so there's always going to be an element of globalization. I think we are tipping back towards at least some form of economies and industry moving back into the States.
And as an investor, Ryland, are you looking at previous civilizations in terms of inflation, printing a lot of money? With the rate of inflation that we're at right now, how is this affecting investors' decisions?
I think it's definitely affecting investors' decisions just on what basic costs of goods are. However, don't underestimate the power of people's values and what they believe. And so we've seen this really wonderful shift that's occurred, and it's continuing, will continue for many decades. But we're in the greatest transfer of wealth the world has ever seen. And so what some older investors in mostly the baby boomer generation believed and had what their investment philosophy was around is much different today than what we have for Gen X, the millennials, Gen Y investors, and also a difference between male and female in their perception of what investing is. And so what we're seeing is that there is a greater adaptation and interest level from female investors and younger generations to invest in companies that have an ethos and that they believe in alignment with their values. And so, costs, yes, drive all sorts of decisions, economic decisions, especially when you're looking at it from an economic strata and where people fall on that continuum. But for the most part, people are going to vote with their dollars based on their values. We're seeing more and more of that going through.
And Bryan, if I'm an investor and I believe that the globe is going to achieve the SDG goals by 2030, or at least attempt to. I know there's a $9 trillion market opportunity for carbon credits. Where am I placing my money? What should I be thinking about?
Yeah, that's one angle of exploring that. The other one, I would be looking for those companies that perhaps kind of were producers of energy under the old model, but are dramatically changing their business model to recognize that power shift and that the energy supply mix is going to change. So it's those companies that are being forward-looking, frankly, kind of sacrificing probably some of the easier gains that could be had in today's immediate world where energy prices are substantially higher than where they were years ago, but are really looking out 5-10 years of where the energy mix is going. I think it's undeniable that the use of alternative energy is going to be an increasing mix going forward.
And we saw, of course, with this recent intrusion of Ukraine, American businesses, many businesses all around them pulling out of Russia and crippling the economy. What is the investor's risk with investments and assets placed in, let's say, high-risk countries that could be a potential threat for war?
Well, just here at the summit, I've heard of several situations where some consulting firms have already said that they've discontinued relationships with companies that are continuing to do business in Russia. You have to be careful about some of those things, but at the same time, I think that's a reality, is that you can vote with your dollars a whole host of ways. Shareholders can vote by being active in their and how they vote with their on their shares. Companies can vote based on who they do business with, and I think we're going to continue to see more of that when you have these situations come up that are human-related incidents that are coming up. So,
one of the facets of impact investing in ESG, which I found pretty fascinating recently, was where's the impact? Is it under the marketing side? Is it under the operational side? One of the questions is, well, why can't it be underneath the legal side? Have you come across any organizations that have incorporated legal structures in a way that they'll reduce their risk as well as govern their businesses responsibly.
Yeah, I don't think I've necessarily seen anything from that angle. I don't know if you've heard anything either.
Not specifically, but I could totally see how that would work. So
from the operational versus the marketing side, what's an attractive organization to you? What are you looking for?
Well, I as you think about legal structure, or just how you're setting up your organizations, there's a great panelist who was talking about how philanthropy was part of their business. And they actually had a board member asking them, well, why do you do that, right? There's no real economic benefit to shareholders. The way he viewed it, and I thought this was really, really interesting, and it really kind of dovetails with a lot of things that we're doing at Arnerich Massena that go above and beyond just serving our clients, but just being a participant in the community. But the reason that they were philanthropic as an organization is because that's what draws their talent base. That's what has drawn their employees to their organization. And so while, yes, it does take away from earnings and ultimately the bottom line, the reality is they view it as kind of a talent attraction tool for their organizations. Something very similar to what we do at Arnerich is we care a lot about our community and have been supportive of a program at one of the local elementary schools called the I Am Learning program, where we're doing outreach to underserved kids in the community who frankly may not have the support at home to excel in schools. And so an hour each week, our employees spend an hour at the local elementary school working with math problems and reading and girls club, and just give them kind of an outlet to kind of engage with a completely different peer group, a completely different set of people, to hopefully kind of encourage them and build some of those skills and that confidence to succeed in school. Another thing that I'm really, really excited that we're doing this year is we're actually going to be the first sponsor of a program called Rock the Street Wall Street, which is helping kind of teenage girls, high school girls with financial literacy and kind of financial education to not just help them in their own careers and their own life path, but maybe introduce them to a career that they never would have considered before. And so that's one thing that we're thinking a lot about is how do we build more diversity and a diversity of thought within our organization, and going above and beyond just kind of the traditional route of how do you go about attracting talent, but let's encourage the community and do our part in kind of spreading the word of there's different career tracks that you may have never considered to be part of that conversation.
Incredible. Well, gentlemen, it's been an incredibly awesome time being with you guys again today.
Thank you so much.
Love the conversation. Bryan, let's bring this home. What is your definition of a real leader?
Well, I think a real leader is somebody who can evolve. If the last 2 years has taught us anything, is organizations need to evolve, and so I think you see that through and through at Arnerich Massena. Is we aren't anything without our staff, and so being responsive to our staff, their needs, but also the needs of the organization, and finding that great harmony between more flexibility, which is obviously where the world is headed, and if you're not kind of paying attention to that, I think you're going to be really challenged to attract talent going forward, but also recognizing that business has needs as well. And so finding that nice harmony, being flexible, but also being forward-looking is really, really important.
Amazing. For Ryland Moore, Bryan Shipley, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, evolve, folks, and always keep it real. Thank you, gentlemen.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.
Good to see you too.
Yeah.